So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session, Transparency, Trust, and Privacy of AI, which sheds the light to a very important aspect of AI ethics, especially if you consider the role of trust in our ongoing pandemic. So to this end, we have a panel which concerns very important questions of the discourse on transparency, trust, privacy of AI. And we have two I would say, important topics which will be discussed today. On the one side, we have the question of transparency and its relation, and the question of whether transparency as a value really matters for individuals. And I think this is a very important question, given the fact that in our societies, we are often debating about the importance and relevance of transparency. But the question really is whether individuals are valuing that. So I'm very happy that Andreas Ostermaier is on our board and dealing with this experimental question. On the other side, we have the question of the Singaporean approach to regulating mental health apps. And I think this is a very important issue too, because for two reasons. On the one side, Singapore is, I think, quite advanced when it comes to the fields of regulating AI, also in terms of ethics principles. Together with Smart Dubai, Singapore is one of the leaders internationally. And also the question of health apps is quite important, given the major privacy concerns. And I think this will be specifically relevant against the backdrop of the increasing use of mental health apps. So I'm also very happy that Mr. Gary Chan, Professor Gary Chan, is joining our ranks in today's discussion. So before we start, I just want to give you some broad information about how today's meeting is about to proceed. So first we have two presentations from Andreas Ostermaier and Mr. Gary Chan. And after that, we will have a discussion. Originally, we planned to have a third panelist, but we are not sure whether she will or he will appear. So we might have a prolonged discussion on both topics. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to introduce to you Andreas Ostermaier, who is a professor of accounting from the University of Southern Denmark in the Department of Business and Economics, who will then introduce us to experimental research on the role of transparency and trust of AI. So the stage is yours, Andreas.
Thanks, Alexander, for introducing me. Yeah, I'm in the field of accounting, but I'm interested in many fields, including AI. And I'm very glad to present joint research with Basti Krügel and Matthias, which is a paper forthcoming in Philosophy and Technology with the title Zombies in the Loop, which is an allusion to the human in the loop, and it will become clear later how we allude to it. The key message of our research is that humans trust untrustworthy AI advisors for ethical decisions. I'd like to start from what I think we may consider a common assumption, that artificial intelligence algorithms are widely distrusted, and therefore trustworthiness and transparency to foster trustworthiness are needed for people to accept AI so that we can reap the societal benefits that it offers. I have three quotes here by governmental and non-governmental institutions, the European Commission, the US National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Office, and the IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. I'm not going to read out all of them because they are similar. Let's just look at the first one. Trustworthiness, the European Commission writes in their ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, is a prerequisite for people and societies to develop, deploy, and use AI systems. Without AI systems being trustworthy, unwanted consequences will ensue and their uptake might be hindered, preventing the realization of the potentially vast benefits that this technology can bring. So that is the assumption. There is a lack of trustworthiness, and we need to make AI more trustworthy. The other two quotes are very similar in mind. Now, this is, of course, an empirical statement that people distrust AI and that trustworthiness needs to be fostered, which deserves investigation. And we start from the hypothesis that actually people might trust AI, at least if it comes to ethical decisions, rather too much than too little. And we designed 3 studies to explore this question and to check whether we are right. In those 3 studies, we incrementally decrease the degree of trustworthiness of AI-powered algorithms, and we check whether people are willing to follow the advice of those algorithms regardless of the level of trustworthiness. So in our first study, we check whether people trust advice from an AI-powered algorithm that is actually trustworthy. If people trust AI-powered algorithms at all, then we should see in this very case that they actually follow the advice from AI-powered algorithms. So this study is essentially to establish our experimental baseline. Then we move on in the second study to introduce an AI-powered algorithm which is possibly untrustworthy and check whether they still follow the advice. And we move further in the third study to introduce an AI-powered algorithm that is most likely untrustworthy. In each of those studies, we have decision makers face a decision, and I'll introduce that decision in a minute, where they are advised by an AI-powered algorithm. In the first study, they are alternatively advised, that is 2 treatments, by an impartial human advisor or an algorithm whose advice is based on the judgments of impartial human advisors. So the only difference is it's in both cases impartial human advisors, which are the basis of the advice. In the case of the AI advisor, this advice just filters through the AI, and therefore it should be considered at least as trustworthy as advice coming directly from an impartial human advisor. In the second study, we replace that AI advisor with an algorithm we know nothing about. So people get advice without knowing what the algorithm's advice is based on. And in the third study, the algorithm's advice is based on the judgments of convicted criminals. Let me give you an overview of how we collected the data. These are experiments that we ran on Cloud Research. That is the academic version of Amazon's Mechanical Turk. We have recruited about 2,000 subjects to volunteer to participate in our study. We had an attention check included to sort out those participants who would just check boxes without really reading our instructions. And removing those from our sample, we are left with 1,600 subjects, 650 of these going into our first and third study, respectively, where we had an additional treatment, and about half of these 300 to the second study. 40% of our sample were male. The age averaged 44 years, and the study was conducted earlier this year in spring. The experiment took participants about 5 minutes time, and they got $1.25 in compensation. In each of those experiments, the participants faced a trade-off between friendship and duty. That trade-off came in 3 flavors, 3 scenarios: an occupational and health and a legal scenario. So different scenarios, but same trade-off. In each of those cases, there was an AI-powered algorithm who advised the decision maker either for or against the friend. And we manipulated, as I've just shown, whether this advice was based on impartial humans in our first study. We don't know what in our second study, or convicted criminals in our third study. The variable of interest, where we check the effect of our manipulation is the decision that our subjects take and how it differs depending on whether the algorithm advises for or against the friend. Just as a side note, we tried to minimize social pressure to rule out that effect from our experiment. And so we told the participants that neither the friend nor the other person they were deciding on would ever know about the algorithm. The advice was confidential and no one would ever learn whether the decision maker followed it. To make it more transparent how the study worked, let me briefly introduce the first scenario, the business scenario, as an example. There are two more of those scenarios, the health and the legal scenario, which are very similar. So I'd just like to refer you to the paper for these, so feel free to ask me, but I think it's enough for the understanding of our study to look at the first one. And specifically, I have here the case where the trustworthy AI advisor advises against hiring the friend. So the decision to make is introduced as follows. Suppose you are responsible for recruitment, you have a vacancy and two applicants. One applicant is a friend, the other is a stranger. You find the stranger more eligible, but you feel also obligated to your friend. Now the AI advisor enters the scene. There is an AI-powered algorithm that will tell you whether it is ethically acceptable to decide in favor of a friend in such situations. And now, because this is the study with the trustworthy AI, the algorithm imitates human decisions based on the ethical judgments of impartial human advisors. The additional information, applicants do not know about the algorithm and no one will ever learn whether you follow the advice. The manipulation, according to the algorithm, it is not acceptable to hire your friend. We also have the mirror case where the algorithm finds it acceptable to hire the friend. And the decision to make, or what we are interested in, the dependent variable, says the following statement: I would hire the stranger, not my friend, where full disagreement or 100 means that we hire the stranger, and full disagreement or 0 that we hire the friend. Let's take a look at the results. So what we see is, if we consider the inclination to favor the stranger over the friend, that this inclination is actually higher if the algorithm advises to favor the stranger than when it advises to favor the friend. In the business scenario, as well as the other two scenarios, the differences vary between scenarios, but they are significant in the single cases and overall. For comparison, if we consider a human advisor, which gives the same two types of advice, then we see the same kind of effect. If the human advisor advises to favor the stranger, the inclination is higher than if it advises in favor of the friend. Again, the differences vary between the three scenarios, but overall, they are significant across the three scenarios. And the bottom line of this first study is that people heed the advice of trustworthy AI-powered advisors, just like the advice of human advisors. We do see a difference in their inclination to decide in favor of the stranger, depending on the advice given by the algorithm. In the second study, the situation is the very same, except for different information about the AI-powered advisor. In this case, we tell the participant that it is unknown what the algorithm's advice is based on, and this should make the algorithm somewhat suspicious because you don't know anything about it. Otherwise, the decision to be made is exactly the same. And now, interestingly, we find in this case of an intransparent and possibly untrustworthy AI advisor the same result as we found before. If the AI advisor's advice is to favor the stranger, the inclination to favor the stranger over the friend is higher than if it advises to favor the friend. The differences vary in the three scenarios. For example, in the health scenario is not significant in this case, but taking together the outcomes, the effect is significant overall. So people are willing to follow advice from a possibly untrustworthy, from an untransparent AI-powered advisor. Let's go to our third study, where we further decrease the level of trustworthiness of the AI-powered advisor. Now we tell that the algorithm imitates human decisions based on the ethical judgments of convicted criminals in such situations. Everything else is the same. And interestingly, again, we see that people follow the advice of the AI-powered advisor. If it advises in favor of the stranger, the inclination to favor the stranger is higher than when it advises for the friend. This difference is significant in all three scenarios, and of course also on average. For comparison, if we have a human criminal giving advice, then we see that there is no significant difference between the inclination to decide in favor of the stranger or the friend, depending on what that advice is. That is, in this case, people distrust the advice and they basically disregard it. So we see that they follow advice from an untrustworthy AI advisor, but they do not follow the advice of an untrustworthy human advisor. Let me briefly summarize our findings and the contribution. So the finding from the first study is that the algorithm's advice influences the decision maker's decisions just like as if it came from an impartial human advisor. That's what we see in our first study. We observe neither what is known as algorithm appreciation nor algorithm aversion. Second, considering the third and second study, we basically find that people don't care about how trustworthy the advisor is. They follow the AI advisor, whether it's trustworthy first study, possibly untrustworthy second study, or most likely untrustworthy third study. And as an additional finding, I've not shown any pictures on that one, users overconfidently believe that others are more susceptible to the algorithm influence. You know that problem. Everyone thinks that they are a better car driver than the average of the population. Similar observation here. How do we contribute? There is that common assumption that AI needs to be transparent and trustworthy because otherwise it is distrusted. We do not find this at all. We find that people trust algorithms rather too much than too little, as long as it comes to ethical matters at least, and they don't really care about transparency. What does that mean? We do not argue that algorithms should not be transparent or that they should not be trustworthy. The point that we make here is just that from an empirical viewpoint, according to the results that we have, it doesn't matter for whether people accept the ethical advice coming from the algorithm. They just follow it, although it is untransparent and possibly untrustworthy. This has some practical implications. First, it's probably good news that people are willing to accept ethical advice coming from algorithms because that opens an entire new field for the use of AI. But on the other hand, it is also worrisome that they don't really reflect on that advice, even when there are indicators that they should be careful about it, like that it comes from people who most others would consider untrustworthy, the convicted criminals. Now, why do we say zombies in the loop? Because this is a caveat against the human in the loop approach. Very often when AI is involved in decision making, we also involve human decision makers and tell people, well, there is AI involved in that decision about your matters, but you are not delivered to the decision of AI. There is a human control for that decision. But now, if that human control, and we had that in our study, doesn't really critically reflect on that advice, then there is no point for having a human loop in the first place, a human in the loop in the first place. It might make us feel better about the decision, but it doesn't really make a difference, and that is a problem. We see three potential solutions: government or other regulation to make sure that the algorithms are trustworthy and then the human in the loop doesn't really matter. Trial and error, for we know from other studies that people get very careful about AI when they have seen it go wrong. And digital literacy. We believe that digital literacy is the best solution to this problem and that users should be trained to deal with algorithms responsibly. Thanks for your attention. I'd be glad about any questions, and I would also like to refer you to the preprint of our paper, which is available from ArchiveX.
So thank you, Andreas, for this very interesting and insightful presentation. So I have a lot of questions on my own, but first I would like to give the audience the opportunity to address some questions they might have about your research. So are there any questions from the audience?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Letitia. I have a question concerning the takeaways. You talked about how to train users to use algorithms responsibly. I want you to throw more light on that. How can users be trained to use algorithms more responsibly? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. That is actually rather a conclusion that we draw from our study, and we don't address that question specifically, how you can improve digital literacy. But what we think in a nutshell is that it is not enough to make algorithms transparent and then to assume that people would just think about how trustworthy the algorithm is, because that's not what we find, right? So we make the algorithm most transparent in the first and in the third case, where they know that the advice is based on impartial human advisors and where it is based on convicted criminals. And in both cases, this doesn't make a difference. They follow in one case just like the other. So maybe it needs more than to make the functioning of the algorithm transparent. We also need to tell people that they need to critically reflect and that they should be aware of the fact that just because there is an algorithm, that algorithm is not necessarily right. If you are there as the human in the loop to check on the algorithm decisions, then you're really supposed to check those algorithms decisions and make your own decision if you think you cannot rely on them. How exactly that can be done best, we don't address that question, but that is probably the most interesting question. So thanks for that question. I hope yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Is there a further question from the audience? So then perhaps I would have two questions. So one is more methodological, but I think that's not a big point concerning the validity of the study, but I'm just interested because the way you defined untrustworthy AI, I think this is quite interesting because there are many ways to do that actually, because untrustworthy AI could be defined as having a bad data set. And I think this is the direction you're basically going, because you say you have a data set which is consisting of these convicted criminals and their patterns are analyzed. So I think this is more going into the direction of data set, but I think you could also go the way of more explicitly stating a bias, for example, that you say, okay, there is some kind of bias in it. I think that including the bias thing would make matters perhaps more complicated, because when you state that there is a bias, you have also to say who is basically negatively affected by the bias and so on and so forth. So I think there is a long chain of other things behind it, but I think I would be very much interested about how you thought about perhaps the alternatives of how to define trustworthy or untrustworthy AI. That is one point. The second point is, I think, the implications of the study. Of course, these are not things you can do at this stage, but I would be interested in your kind of gut feeling, because I think one point could be that people are over-trusting AI, not because they are really trusting AI in a bigger sense, but rather because they want to deflect or evade responsibility for their actions. Because you have constructed a situation as a trade-off, where they have to choose between an abstract duty in a Kantian sense and where you have also your personal inclinations. But if you take this kind of conflict out, and I think you need to have conflict somehow, because to make the experiment more ethical, more interesting, etc. But I think if you take that out, it would also be interesting to look at the findings. So these are my two questions, one more methodological and the other one more concerning the implications.
Both very good questions. We actually had a debate with the reviewers also about how we introduced the untrustworthy or possibly untrustworthy advisor. So the reviewer, for example, said that the ethical judgments of a convicted criminal can also be okay. So the convicted criminal just does the wrong thing, but he knows what he actually should do. But then we found some evidence that people actually do distrust convicted criminals, at least on average. And you could consider this as, in a sense, somewhat implicit manipulation. We didn't want to be too clear about the bias. We would like people also to think about it. So if we tell them explicitly that the data are biased, then that would be a somewhat stronger manipulation. But I think typically an algorithm wouldn't come with the warning that it is biased, but you would rather get information about what the data set is based on. And then you have to make your own opinion about whether that is a reliable database. So that was rather something that we did to get closer to a real setting where there is some red flags, but they are not too explicit. But I fully agree that you could vary that manipulation, and that would also be interesting for further research to explore the robustness of the results. So that would be my thoughts, but I'll be glad to discuss it further. Then the second point about the gut feeling, if you can just give me a reminder about that one.
Yes, absolutely. So I think this concerns the implications of the study, because you observe, and I think there are other studies also going in this direction, that people are over trusting AI, even if the indicators that it is basically a flawed decision. But I think apart from that, it makes
right. It comes back the responsibility sharing thing. I mean, there is. I think there is opinion in research. At least I've read a couple of papers to that effect, that AI cannot really be responsible, or that this is at least a very itchy question. But of course, there is motivated reasoning going on. So if you want to reach a conclusion, and for example, the algorithm advises you that it is okay to favor the friend, and that is what you actually want to do, then you can more easily follow that decision and say, well, it's not mine. I'm relying on advice from the AI. So there is, for example, that famous wiggle room experiment where decisions in one of the treatments by Dana and colleagues were taken basically in a random way, and then people would just wait for the random mechanism to make the decision because it could play out in their sense. So we acknowledge, of course, that this is there. In our study, we held that constant because the algorithm was there in all three treatments. So it shouldn't make a difference for how people follow the advice. But I think that should be part of the education toward digital literacy, to tell people that although you take advice from someone, if you are the decision maker and the other is the advisor, you cannot hold the advisor responsible for the decision at the end. It is your decision. So this is probably something that we can make salient by telling people, I don't think we can get completely rid of the problem that people would just keep others responsible for their own decisions. So I'm not sure whether that's a satisfying answer. I think the short version is we keep it constant, so we don't really look at this problem in this study, but we also having research about that responsibility sharing problem.
Absolutely. And I think it also, of course, it would be an overload of the paper to factor that in. But it's more, my question was more perhaps directed in regard to future research, because I think the paper as it is right now should also not try to solve all problems that it might occur. So I think it's very concise. And
there is at least one paper I'm aware of, one of my co-authors, Matthias and Christina Strobel. I don't know if there is anyone else involved who look exactly at the problem of responsibility sharing. I think in the Journal of Behavioral and Experimental Economics, so there's some stuff on that, and we have another study going on, but actually that's not the focus of this one. But I fully agree that this is a highly interesting question.
Absolutely, because I think what is intriguing for me is I think the fact that you might have some sort of, in this context you're mentioning, this kind of fear of compliance costs, or which might emerge subconsciously, that you say, okay, I have to distinguish between, or to decide between a friend and, let's say, another person, and you might be inclined to go against your friend because you might have the idea that you have certain compliance costs or some kind of expectations which are ingrained in your mind. But I think that's, of course, a very complicated thing, and which requires much more research, obviously. But
thank you. Yeah, I agree.
So thank you very much, Andreas, for this very interesting research. So our next presenter is Gary Chan from the Singapore Management University, and his topic is also very interesting because he deals with data privacy on the one side and also mental health applications. And I think this is a very, very timely topic. So Gary, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Mr. Alexander. Let's just start by sharing the slides. Yeah, okay. So my topic today for this morning is about mental health apps. To what extent are they trustworthy? And I'll try to analyze it from various angles, including legal, ethical, as well as technological angles. Okay. In the next 15 minutes or so, what I will discuss are mainly these 3 points. First, of course, I'll talk about the background to mental health apps, or the use of mental health apps in Singapore as well as elsewhere. I'll talk also about some of the concerns over the use of mental health apps. And then my focus will be on the first bullet point. I'll look at the various laws, regulations, as well as guidelines. Some of them are, I'll say, industry in nature, but these guidelines I'm focusing on for the first bullet point will be related to the regulatory regime. But they are stated not to have any legal force as such. So no mention of any sanctions, all right? And here I will talk about some of the gaps in the laws and regulations, as well as the guidelines. Next, I'll then look at the situation outside Singapore. I will look at some of the measures. They are ethical nature, technological nature. They are targeted, say, at the various groups of people, including app developers, and assess how they may be relevant to Singapore. And I'll end off by some suggestions on the way forward. All right. So I hope this is of relevance to all of you. Okay, mental health apps. Okay, in terms of background, of course, because of COVID-19, I think because of increased isolation and all that, and less of socialization, people do turn to health apps, right? And in terms of mental health apps, what do they actually provide? They provide a combination of things, right? One would be psychoeducation, provide information about various mental disorders, or how stress can affect, for example, mental health conditions. Apart from that, they also provide peer support, right? Basically link the users to, say, a network of people, right, who are interested in these matters. Third, I think in this sense more medical in nature. They attempt to maybe diagnose and then offer recommendations for treatment. Okay, that's a therapy. In other cases, it's not as if there is any illness as such, but maybe ways to deal with stress, right? So it's more of a wellness purpose behind it. And they use various techniques. They will use psychotherapies, for example, CBT, which is fairly established in psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy to change the thinking as well as behavior of the person concerned. Mindfulness techniques, which are quite new in terms of apps, right? To encourage the user to focus on the present and not to be judgmental in their thinking. So how are the apps used? They can be used in conjunction with a doctor's consultation, right, or psychiatrist consultation, including with medicine. It may be face-to-face visits, right? Or it can be used on its own without even any doctor intervention. What are the benefits? Of course, I think this is quite commonsensical. You can see it. The use of apps will allow for convenience, right? It's 24/7. Singapore, I think our in terms of numbers of psychotherapists and psychiatrists is quite low relative to the population. So there's a relative shortage here. It'd be more convenient for the person to access the apps. Of course, accessibility, there's a problem as with any technology, right? There's a problem with inequity, which I'm not actually going to discuss in this seminar. But I think in Singapore, the penetration for use of smartphones for apps is quite high. Okay. But one clear advantage, I think, is for patients who are suffering from these mental health conditions, there could be a social stigma attached, and therefore, to increase anonymity, right, and confidentiality, they would tend to use apps. Singapore has actually done quite a bit in this area. Singapore government is quite interested in mental health. I don't know whether I mentioned it earlier, but there was an increase in terms of suicides during COVID-19 in 2020 compared to previous years. And government has been providing information, self-help tools, right? And they've actually partnered with startups, private startups, to set up even the chatbot platform for mental health. Okay, so I mentioned some of the benefits. Clearly, there are benefits relative to face-to-face, or sometimes when face-to-face consultation with psychiatrists is not possible. Right? But however, there are some gaps. So I'll just mention three. First would be safety. Do the apps cause harm? Right? I mean, on the surface, they seem quite harmless in themselves, right? And it's true, in many cases, let's say if it's a wellness app, maybe the harm element is not really there, right? But I think there are some cases where it can cause harm. So I gave some examples. For example, the apps that relate to suicide prevention. That could be problematic if anything goes wrong, right? And there has been a survey of such apps, and it shows that some of them do not actually follow any clinical guidelines for dealing with people with suicidal ideation. And one danger in using apps is that the user may think that the app is helping when it actually is not, right? Let's say it's not following guidelines. And they delay in seeking actual professional help. Third example is the studies concerning chatbots, right? Thankfully, it's a study, it's not actually implemented, whereby chatbots in trying to respond to the users' queries on suicide, right? They actually gave wrong replies that maybe a psychiatrist wouldn't give. And the study assessed the potential harm arising from that. Next, do the apps work as intended? Right. In this area, I think I've looked at some of the studies, and I've tried to focus on those that are based on randomized controlled trials. Right. And I think for depression, there's a lot of good evidence actually that apps do help. Some apps do help, right? So one example will be the one that's quite popular, Headspace app for mindfulness training. Yeah. So that one has been employed, and there is quite a bit of benefit of that based on the evidence. But however, there are some variations. For example, for bipolar, apparently the apps have not been shown to be effective thus far. So it depends on the nature of the condition. So we have to be careful of that. And there is less information for children and adolescents using the apps. But most of the evidence, clinical trials are for adults. So we cannot assume that just because CBT, for example, right, as a face-to-face method works, that if you deliver it through the app, it will work. I think it still should be tested based on clinical trials. Next is privacy. So do the apps infringe your rights to privacy as well as security of data? So there was an incident, right, in 2014, whereby this particular group, suicide prevention group, using the Twitter feed of users, right? They gave suggestions of people, the users, who were suffering from depression or suicidal ideation. Okay, as you can imagine, right, that led to a public backlash. Right? People were worried about their privacy, you know, and also being some of the users were designated as suffering from depression, all that. Although the intention was good to help the other users be alerted to their fellow users' conditions, there was a privacy problem, so they had to withdraw the app. And also there were studies about certain apps that did not have encryption, and some without actual privacy policies, and they didn't actually have proper disclosures about how they are using the information and so forth. Right? So I will try to analyze this concerns using the trust factors, using a three-pronged approach based on technological measures that can help, what are legal as well as ethical measures. Okay. Now focus on the Singapore situation. Okay. Just as a general view, after reviewing the Singapore position, I think although there are some relevant laws that help, I would say that it's widely dispersed, at least from the view of a layperson. It's very widely dispersed. Even from a view of a lawyer, it can be difficult to find the law on this concerning mental health apps. So it's very wide. Different authorities are handling different parts of the concerns relating to mental health apps. Then on the whole, although I think it's useful, there are certain gaps and ambiguities which I'll mention. So one set of laws and regulations will be concerning medical device. That is, whether the mental health app qualifies as a mental device. If so, then it will be regulated by these rules. Right? So there are laws on this, and I'll just mention one set of regulatory guidelines for telehealth products. Right? So one criteria is this: is that device, the mental health app, used for medical purpose? So medical purpose will include, say, diagnosis, treatment, for example, leading to physiological or problems or mental disorders, right? So you exclude wellness apps. It's not regulated under this. There are risk classifications for software, what they call software medical devices under this. The problem with these guidelines are that they mainly talk about health apps. If they do talk about health apps, it's about the physiological problems. Very little about mental health problems, right? Next, there's a pathway in Singapore whereby if you get approval already in some of those countries there, Australia, Canada, EU, Japan, and US, right? And on top of that, there are no safety issues in the last 3 years. And there's not been any prior rejection or withdrawals. Then Singapore would look at it favorably from a regulatory angle and probably approve it. So that, just as give an example, there's an app called a RESET, R-E-S-E-T app, which is used for users rather, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, for people suffering from substance disorders. Yeah. So that has been approved because US FDA has approved it previously and there have been no safety lapses. Next set of guidelines will be the national telemedicine. It doesn't state that it has any legal force, right? And although you would say that it does apply, right? Because it's about delivery of health services over ICT, over remote platforms and all that. But there's very, very little mention of health apps. Okay, so the focus doesn't seem to be health apps, it being enacted only in 2015. Just give other examples on medical devices. Okay, we have come up with a very recent one on software. So this is more applicable to mental health apps. But it states that there's no legal effect. Okay? It shows that the authority is thinking about this matter, right? It is still investigating, exploring. Right? And one additional factor is that upon deployment, there are certain other regulatory issues after it's been implemented in real-world conditions. So this is about robust technology, right? Which is important for trust. I think I'll skip this part except to mention this is just the second part is just a summary of the 5 agencies I spoke about from EU, Japan, so on and so forth. Just focus on the third one. So there is also focus amongst these agencies on the safety and performance of software medical devices, including how AI would impact, when these devices are applied in the real world. Beyond software medical devices, I look at other legal issues. I think it's important to look at consumer protection. Okay, and over here, because this statute has been enacted quite some time ago, there's no focus actually on mental health as such. In fact, the statute doesn't specifically say it covers health services in order to protect consumers, right? And doesn't really refer to online methods. Okay, so I think there's an ambiguity there whether it does cover mental health apps. Then I look at advertising. It seems that there are different layers, as I mentioned, different authorities handling the same matter. So it can be quite complicated for the layperson in terms of trust, right? So the second one is obvious, where it's a medical device, then that regulation will apply, the advertising regulation. But there are some which only applies to when it's used in conjunction with doctors using the apps under the first bullet point, right? And the third one, Singapore Code of Advertising Practice, where it's used more generically for laypersons. Data protection. We have a set of data protection laws, right? Which, of course, mandates the organization handling your data to ensure it's consent for a specific purpose before it uses it, before it discloses the information. There is obligation to ensure accuracy of the data. Okay? And should there be a data breach, which is happening increasingly often, I'm afraid, then there is obligation to notify ASAP. This is something new. Actually, it wasn't there, right? I think it was 2019 or 2020 when they put that in. But there's a slight ambiguity there, whether it applies to app developers who are not doing it for a business, right? If they're doing it for business, I think they'll be caught by the statute. But if they're doing it in a personal capacity or domestic capacity there, then they may not be covered by this. So this gap probably has to be filled in some other way. Okay. Last one, this more legalistic, I guess, is about liabilities. It's about responsibility. If something goes wrong, accountability. Should a doctor be accountable? So this under the general tort law, civil law. So when they recommend an app, did they actually ensure that the app is safe? Can doctors argue that, I'm relying on, say, my health authority's approval for the app? Since it's been approved, can I reasonably rely on it? That could be a defense, right? Has the doctor actually advised on the risks pertaining to apps when they use it in conjunction with their medical services? So now I've covered the Singapore situation, right? Now I'll look beyond that to see how some other principles out there concerning mental health apps can help our Singapore situation. Can it fill some of the gaps, right? Some of these are ethical in nature and technological in nature. Why is there a need to look at all this? It's because even if the Singapore laws are perfect in this area, right, it has limited what we call jurisdiction. It's limited only to covering problems that arise and where the apps are used, right, with a Singapore connection. That means used for a Singapore consumer, for instance, or somebody based in Singapore, right? So there's some limitation there. And second, if the app developer is the person that's causing the problem is outside of Singapore, there's no presence in Singapore, you can't enforce anything against them. So in terms of guidelines, these are the last 2 slides. I've looked at some standards for medical professions when they use health apps in conjunction with the delivery of services. And the Canadian Medical Association has specific rules relating to, advising patients whether it's safe before they use the app for the patients. The doctor have to go through certain steps to think through before recommending an app, right? In contrast, I think Singapore doesn't have that. Our medical profession doesn't have rules on the use of health apps, not to mention mental health apps. Therefore, I mean, this is something I think we should look at. Apart from doctors, there could be psychologists, what I call that, medical social workers using such apps, right? So maybe you can also put some principles in their professional ethics. Next, there are some useful information in terms of guidance documents from governments and regulators outside of Singapore, and they're targeting at app developers, right? So one example would be a very recent one, the European Committee for Standardization. In August 2021, they came out with some guidelines to help app developers when they build the apps, right, to assess the quality and the safety of the apps. Yeah, so I thought that was quite useful. And on top of that, I think US FTC also has some best practices, and UK too. Right? Third, technological measures. That means these are the ones from app stores themselves. I'm talking about Google and the App Store Review Guideline, right? So these are the guidelines. They focus mainly on privacy, right? Privacy of the data. So they are telling the app developers who want to have their apps enrolled into their app stores to ensure the privacy concerns are met. On top of that, I think now they're focusing more on health apps, and they are worried about misleading claims. So I think that's quite useful. Third, there is a certification. So this is where these private entities or health agencies, they put in those apps that, in their view, meet certain good guidelines, right? And they put it in a repository to say that these are good apps in that sense for mental health or health. And finally, some suggestions. So in view of some of the gaps in the laws and regulations, I think Singapore should consider maybe clarifying some of these statutes or guidelines, right? Whether they actually apply to mental health apps. And if so, whether they could discuss a bit more about how they apply to mental health apps, right? For example, consumer protection. Next, to maybe incorporate guidelines in the professional ethics of doctors or for medical social workers or psychologists. Guidelines concerning mental health apps at the moment is missing. Third point there, which is to develop, maybe this is something the government could do. Our government is actually coming out with a portal on mental health resources, but no mention thus far of laws, right? So maybe there could be a website, micro site on specific laws, regulations, and associated guidelines that relate to mental health. They should be stated in a very simple, accessible manner because layperson users are being affected by it. And it will be good actually to have educated consumers, right, or users to actually ensure that their rights are being protected. And finally, there are actually some standardized information from app developers, as I mentioned earlier, but maybe there could be a bit more. For example, thus far, there's not so much mention about a disclaimer that states in the app, right? Whether it applies to certain kinds of audience, especially those with certain kinds of disorders, and states specifically that those from outside the targeted audience should not be using those apps because there are risks involved, for instance. All right. So just to add on to this point about the information available inside the apps itself. So with that, thanks for your patience. Thank you very much for listening.
So thank you, Gary, for this very interesting presentation on the legal situation in Singapore. And I have already seen that there is a question in the chat regarding your presentation from Susanna.
No, thank you very much, Gary. That was a fantastic presentation. I was only making a comment with regards to who should be liable should the output or the data that comes from medical devices or fitness devices, these health apps, occur. That was just a comment. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much for that. I'll look more into this. Yeah, you're right, because on one hand, it's about medical practitioners, right, who could be liable if they use app in conjunction with their delivery. But yes, there's another aspect which I'm also looking at, which is about app developers. So insofar as the tort of negligence is concerned, the civil law, I think it should be based on some kind of foreseeability. Right? So if the app developers can foresee that when doctors use their apps, or when consumers use their apps on their own, that there could be a risk of harm to the consumer. And maybe it's something that the doctor would not know, because maybe it's a technology-related kind of issue. And if it's foreseeable that it can happen, and knowing this foreseeable risk, these app developers, right, they do enough to actually avert that risk. I think they should be another party that we should look at for legal accountability. So I fully agree with that, but I need to look a bit further on the technology-related issues. So thanks a lot, Susanna. Thanks.
So are there any further questions in relation to this presentation? So perhaps I would also have one point, because you mentioned it on the slide, namely the notion of screen privacy. And I think this is a very interesting issue, because I think I'm not sure whether I understood correctly, so please clarify I'm wrong. But screen privacy is understood as that there is a person standing behind the person perhaps using a smartphone, and that the app does not appear immediately. Is it something like that, or what is understood as screen privacy?
Oh, I see. So for screen privacy, it will be cases whereby actually the screen embeds, right, certain data, say concerning the user, which actually would be quite easy to access, say even by a third party, right, who's not the owner of that smartphone. And this embedded data, when you click on it, actually reveals very private, health-sensitive information about the user. So so is it possible to minimize something like that? Because there's always that risk, right? That the smartphone may be made available to somebody other than the person suffering from the mental health condition.
I think so too, and I think this is especially relevant when it comes also to like personal discrimination, and perhaps also like the real life experience. I think this is in reality perhaps the most obvious case of privacy violations that might happen just of the design of certain technologies. So thank you for informing us on that. Susanna, you have a further comment, I see.
Yes, thank you. That's really interesting. If I consider, I'm South African, so when a number of years ago, when they were testing or sending out SMS messages to HIV positive patients, this was an issue, and they thought perhaps if we have voice calls instead of an SMS and we get the patient to respond, and a similar problem came up. It was who is in the vicinity that can actually hear the patient responding to the questions that are being put forward. So yeah, it just made me think of that when you were discussing screen privacy. So there's screen privacy, and there's also, the spoken word privacy.
Thanks very much, Susanna, for that point. In fact, in Singapore, a few years ago, there was this issue, not about mental health apps, about HIV data, or data about HIV patients. There was a leakage, actually. I guess it's not a systemic problem, that one. It was due to persons in the responsible officers who did not actually safeguard some of the data, right? And some of the government data relating to HIV patients was actually leaked out. So there was a big hoo-ha about it. And some of the government personnel tried to avert a crisis, but actually making calls to the affected persons to say that I'm afraid actually your data has been leaked out. So we just want to let you know. So if there's need be, you can actually talk to your family members about it and all that. Yeah. So of course, that mitigates to some extent, but cannot fully resolve the situation. Yeah, so I think it's important to think about the methods by which we deliver sensitive information. Yeah, I think what I've come across is something that's more for embodied AI. That means in a robot therapist. Although there's no actual robot therapist now that can replace an actual therapist, so the therapists are safe at the moment. There is this issue that if that can happen, then the delivery of the advice from the robot therapist and the information divulged by the patient to the therapist, right, should be safeguarded, and we should consider the context in which that disclosure by the patient is made to the therapist. Is it in a private setting, sufficiently private setting, so that the information won't be leaked out and exposed. Thanks very much, Susanna.
So thank you very much for both interesting presentations. So we're right now running out of time. And I think there is also much more to be said about both topics. So especially, I think the overlap, I think, between both presentations is also interesting when it comes then to responsibility issues for AI decisions and the context of privacy and trustworthiness. So thank you very much again for your presentations. It was a pleasure to lead this panel, and I hope seeing you soon again. Have a nice time.